The situation in the US is red hot. With the presidential election less than a year away, the border with Mexico is once again one of the most important issues gaining prominence in the campaign. As you already know, immigration, and more specifically Mexican immigration, was one of the key issues that catapulted Donald Trump to the White House in 2016. And since then, this issue, rather than calming down, has been getting worse and worse. In the last 3 years, the number of illegal immigrant encounters by the Border Patrol has multiplied. The situation is so tense that it has even fueled an old independence movement in Texas. And yes, the likelihood of this movement succeeding is practically nil, but it is a sign of the enormous discontent that exists amongst a very significant part of the population. And I know what you're wondering. What on earth has happened to cause immigration to skyrocket so much? Has Biden opened wide the border? No, nothing could be further from that. In fact, Joe Biden has followed an immigration policy very much in line with that of his predecessor, Donald Trump. What really triggered this wave of migration was COVID-19. The pandemic wreaked havoc in many Latin American countries and impoverished the region. In the US, however, the opposite has been true. In the wake of the pandemic, Americans seem to be experiencing a veritable golden era with their economy, while countries such as the UK and Germany are still struggling to recover and leave behind their pre-COVID GDP capita levels. The US has not only recovered, but is growing at a faster rate than in the pre-COVID era. Unemployment is at a record low, and perhaps more importantly, the wages that have grown the most are precisely those of the poorest sector of the population, that is, those of immigrants and underprivileged groups. The American dream is in full swing, and that explains why so many people are once again willing to sacrifice everything to cross the Rio Grande border. And keep in mind, this is not just us speculating. As you can see in this graph, the strength of the US labor market is closely linked to immigration. The more job openings there are, the more migrants arrive. And this is exactly what explains the current situation. Over the past few years, the United States has entered a very critical phase with its labor market. Remember the Great Resignation and quiet quitting? Following the pandemic and the monetary stimulus, many businesses became understaffed. There was a surplus of jobs and a shortage of people to fill them. This drove up costs for companies. Firstly, because they had to pay higher salaries to recruit staff, and secondly, because they had to devote more and more resources to finding replacements and mitigating staff turnover. So why was this a problem? Because the costs translated into higher prices. While in Europe, the high inflation of recent years can be explained in large part by energy prices, in the USA, half of it is due to the lack of personnel. And don't get us wrong, higher wages are great economic news, but in this particular case, it also meant a more expensive shopping basket, higher interest rates to combat inflation, and more difficulties for families in accessing credit. In fact, according to a very recent paper by the former US Secretary of the Treasury, this sense of higher wages, but also higher prices and financial difficulties, leads many Americans to believe that they are experiencing an economic recession despite good figures. And knowing this leads us to the crux of the matter. It is clear to us that the US needs labor to reduce costs, inflation, and to allow companies to invest and expand. But on the other hand, we have both Trump and Joe Biden being very strict on immigration, or at least illegal immigration. So what's the solution? Just carry on as before? Well, one option would be to go through the legal channels. If companies need workers, they should use regulated methods to give visas to immigrants, right? I'm sorry, but no. The immigration legal processes in the United States are a huge mess. What you are seeing is a summary of all the requirements and bureaucratic procedures necessary to obtain a permanent work visa for this country. Don't worry, because I don't understand anything either. Although, yes, I know, there are also temporary visas to work for a certain period of time. Maybe those are easier to get, right? Well, I'm sorry, but the US federal bureaucracy is just as much of a pain in the ass for this visa as well. It is a whole regulatory maze involving 7 different regulatory agencies. And let's see, the problem is not only that the requirements are long and tedious, but that they directly cause the breaking down of the immigration system. For what reason? For starters, the visa process is not initiated by immigrants, but by companies. When a company needs workers, it can apply for immigrants, who then apply for the visa themselves. So what's the problem? First of all, the issuance of temporary visas is limited by law. Only 66,000 can be issued per year, a number that, although it may seem high, barely covers a quarter of all actual requests. This is a maximum that has not been updated since 1990 and is leaving many companies without a workforce. The question is, if visa numbers numbers are insufficient, how do you decide which company is allocated visas and which is not? It sounds like a joke, but it is decided by means of a lottery. Yes, that's what I said. The American immigration process is practically a raffle. On top of that, the procedure must be carried out half a year in advance. That is, before applying for immigrants, a company has to know how many workers it will need 6 months in advance, and that's without being sure of winning the visa lottery. So you could spend half a year preparing a contract, spend almost $7,000 on average, which are the legal costs of dealing with the immigration procedures, and then still be left without a visa due to a lottery. But wait, because that's not the worst of it. The United States, in many ways, is very open-minded, yes, but on the immigration issue, no comment. They are practically allergic to everything foreign. So much so that if a company solicits an immigrant worker for months, does all the paperwork, leaves the money, and wins the immigration lottery, but 20 days before the end of the process a US citizen arrives and applies for the job, the company will be forced to accept the American, to give up the immigrant worker, and the visa will be cancelled. What do you make of that? This regulatory trap is so discriminatory that even many US citizens have begun to take advantage of it. And how do they do that? For example, in the US, many unemployment benefits are conditional on the person actively looking for work. If you don't look for a job, you lose the assistance. So what do many smart people do? They look for companies that are looking for immigrants, and they apply for the job, and the immigrants can no longer access the job. And the problem is not that, but rather that since those who have the skills only apply for the job to maintain their public benefits, they soon quit or do not show up for work at all. To give you an idea of the magnitude of this phenomenon, in 2011, only 6% of US job seekers actually worked for the full length of their contract.
A Maryland landscaper advertised 25 H-2B jobs. 25 U.S. workers applied, 3 showed up for interviews, and only 2 lasted more than 2 weeks on the job. H-2B, visas, the complex process for non-agricultural employers to hire guest workers.
Not surprisingly, the lack of visas and the hellish bureaucratic processes affect companies terribly. To put concrete figures on it, it is estimated that the fact that the government approves all the visas a company needs improves its profits by 21.7%. Yeah, that's correct, 21.7%. It's crazy how much US businesses could improve simply by facilitating legal migration processes. In any case, so far we have been talking about low-skilled immigration, which is undoubtedly the most covered in the media. But let me tell you that the big problem is with regard to engineers, scientists, programmers, mathematicians, and other highly qualified professionals. Listen up.
No Chinese, no Europeans, only Americans.
As many of you may already know, Biden has declared a full-blown trade war on China in the manufacture of electronic components, such as semiconductors. What's more, the US does not want to depend on Asia for state-of-the-art chips. After all, a Chinese blockade in areas such as Taiwan or South Korea, which control much of the semiconductor production, could leave the US without chips and advanced electronic circuits for its aircraft, weapons, or computers. In other words, it would leave Uncle Sam militarily compromised. Now, how does Biden hope to cut his dependence on Asia? Well, in large part by spending millions of public dollars and building chip factories on US soil. Biden has bet more strongly than ever on Made in America. So what's the problem? The problem is that in order to produce competitive chips, it is not enough to throw millions of dollars at the problem as Washington has been doing. Human capital, scientists, engineers, they are fundamental. But of course, with US immigration restrictions, believe me, this is not something that money can buy right now. For several decades now, immigrants have been in the majority in jobs requiring a doctorate in a scientific or technical discipline. In other words, it is immigrants who dominate the US technology sector. These immigrants are responsible for 1/3 of all patents approved in the country, as well as Nobel Prizes. And as you might imagine, with all the new demand induced by Biden's subsidy programs to the local tech industry, such as the famous CHIPS Act, these workers are more in demand than ever. We are talking about an increase in demand that has almost doubled in the last 2 years. Biden needs skilled immigration to fulfill his industrial plans. So the question is clear. Do these skilled immigrants have the same problems immigrating to the US as lower skilled workers? Indeed, yes, in many ways. They have the same problems. In fact, this group was the most adversely affected by Donald Trump's immigration restrictions. It's funny, Trumpist rhetoric against immigration focused on Mexico, yet in practice, it was scientists and high-value profiles that were most affected. The number of rejections of these workers increased threefold following the passage of an executive order whose name says it all: the Buy American and Hire American Executive Order. The result? Well, for instance, these days, according to a recently published report, 82% of companies in the defense sector report having problems finding workers with this highly qualified technical profile. And despite the fact that the vast majority of foreign technology students want to stay in the US at the end of their studies, only 11% of graduates succeed. Not only does the US not accept talent, it expels talent already living in the country. Crazy. On top of that, the H-1B visa system, which applies to this type of profile, suffers from many of the same problems we have already explained. It is a slow, expensive process with few guarantees and a limit that makes it all come down to lotteries in the end. What's more, there are points where these visas are even worse than for low-skilled workers. Because unlike low-skilled profiles, mathematicians, engineers, and biologists have access to long-term jobs, not just a few months. For this reason, it is typical for many to take their family with them. And the problem is that the US administration counts them as having issued multiple visas instead of one. In other words, a worker needs his or her visa, along with one for each of the family members. And what does that mean? The limit of visas allowed per year in the US is largely reached with family members of workers. In other words, a child or spouse occupies the visa of another potential worker, instead of simply being able to enter the country under his or her parent's visa. And let's remember that we are talking about highly skilled workers, with whom virtually no one has a problem, and who are absolutely vital to the innovation and competitiveness of American companies. Today, this problem remains unresolved, but it is so blatant that more and more voices in both parties are calling for understanding.
The U.S. must compete in the global race for talent by working to attract and retain the best and brightest minds to contribute to the U.S. economy and drive U.S. productivity. Cannot afford to take for granted that it will remain the destination of choice for STEM students.
But given the state of politics in the United States, it does not seem straightforward for this bureaucratic mess to be changed. But having come this far, now it's your turn. Is it really the economic boom that explains this massive influx of immigrants? Do you think the U.S. labor market is dynamic enough to absorb them? Why is the US shooting itself in the foot with highly skilled immigration? You can leave me your answers down in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to the channel and hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like the video, like it, and I'll see you in the next one. All the best. See you next time.